Alright, in this video we're going to talk about section 2.4, sum and difference formulas. So on the screen and on your paper you see 6 different sum and difference formulas, all of them of the form sine, cosine, or tangent of u plus or minus v. These are things that you are not going to have memorized. If and when this shows up on a quiz and a test, I will give these to you, but you do need to be familiar with them. You do need to be able to recognize when you're using them and when you need to use them. So, just jumping right in, there's a bunch of different ways where we could use these things, and here's one of them. So find the exact value of sine of pi over 12. Now, pi over 12 is not on our unit circle, but this wants the exact value. So we don't want to just put into our calculator and get something weird, some decimal. I want an actual answer in terms of radicals. So what we need to think about is, can I do anything with that pi over 12? That pi over 12 to make it match something on our unit circle. So if we think about pi over 12 and what we have on our unit circle, we have pi's over 3 and pi's over 4. So if we were to combine those together with a common denominator, it would be pi over 12. So how we want to think about this is pi over 12 is actually going to be equal to pi over 3 minus pi over 4. Now if you want to take the time, get your common denominator, this would be 4 pi over 12, this would be 3 pi over 12, so 4 pi over 12 minus 3 pi over 12 is just 1 pi over 12. So when we see the sine of pi over 12, we can rewrite that as sine of pi over 3 minus pi over 4. And now we have a difference formula. So according to our formulas on that last slide or at the top of your page, we know that sine of some angle u minus some other angle v is going to be equal to sine u cosine v minus cosine u sine v. So now what we have to do is just use pi over 3 and pi over 4 as u and v. So sine of pi over 3 minus pi over 4 is going to be equal to sine of pi over 3 cosine of pi over 4 minus cosine of pi over 3 sine of pi over 4. And now all of these things are in terms of angles that we have on the unit circle, so we can just say, well, I know the sine of pi over 3 is going to be radical 3 over 2. Cosine of pi over 4 is radical 2 over 2. Cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2. Sine of pi over 4 is radical 2 over 2. So then we just need to multiply these things. So radical 3 times radical 2 is radical 6. 2 times 2 is 4. 1 times radical 2 is radical 2. 2 times 2 is 4. So you can either keep it as radical 6 over 4 minus radical 2 over 4, or you can combine them since we have a common denominator already and say radical 6 minus radical 2 over 4. So that's one thing that we can do. We can take angles that aren't on the unit circle and we can mess around with them and try to get them to be on the unit circle. We can also look at something like this. Prove the cofunction identity cosine of pi over 2 minus x is equal to sine of x. So on the original set of identities that I gave you, this was one of them that was on there that we didn't have to have memorized. But now we can prove using our sum and difference. So if we look at this, we have something minus something inside our cosine. So if we look at our answer, our list of identities, we know that this is going to be equal to cosine of pi over 2 times cosine of x, so that's cosine u cosine v, plus sine of pi over 2 sine of x, so that would be sine u sine v based on our formula sheet. Now, cosine of pi over 2, so if we go think about unit circle, pi over 2 is up here. Cosine of that's going to be 0. 0 times cosine of x is just 0. Plus sine of pi over 2, that's going to be 1 times sine of x. So our answer there is just going to be sine of x. All right, so moving on. Simplify cosine of theta minus 3 pi over 2. So we need to use that same thing that we just had a second ago, cosine of u minus v. So that's going to be cosine of theta, cosine of 3 pi over 2, plus sine of theta, sine of 3 pi over 2. So cosine of theta times cosine of 3 pi over 2, cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0. Sine of 3 pi over 2 is negative 1. So all of this stuff is going to be equal to negative sine of theta. Alright, so moving on. A couple more problems and then we'll call it quits on the video. Actually, this last problem and then we'll call it quits on the video. So example 4, we want to find all solutions of the equation sine of x plus pi over 4 plus sine of x minus pi over 4 equals negative 1 on the interval 0 to 2 pi. So we notice that we have sum and difference, so we can turn this first one using our formulas into sine of x cosine of pi over 4 plus cosine x sine of pi over 4. So that's the first term, right? That's our sine x plus pi over 4. Then we're going to have sine of x, so plus sine of x cosine pi over 4 minus cosine x sine of pi over 4. And that's going to be, those last two terms are coming from this one. And that still equals negative 1. So looking here and here, we have a negative cosine x sine pi over 4, positive cosine x sine pi over 4. Those things are going to cancel. We have these things here. That's going to be 2 of those. So 2 sine of x cosine of pi over 4 equals negative 1. We know cosine of pi over 4 is radical 2 over 2 equals negative 1. Our 2's can cancel. So we have sine of x times radical 2 equals negative 1. Divide by radical 2. So negative 1 over the square root of 2. If we rationalize, because that doesn't look like anything on our unit circle, but if we rationalize, we get negative square root of 2 over 2. So then we just have to think, where on our unit circle does the sine of x equal negative radical 2 over 2? And that's going to be at 5 pi over 4 and 7 pi over 4. So basically all we really have to do is, whenever we see a plus or a minus inside a sine, cosine, tangent, just go to your formula sheet, write out your sines and cosines. Sometimes you'll have variables, sometimes you'll have things on the unit circle, if it's on the unit circle. Simplify it because you know what the values are, and then kind of go from there. So that'll do it for this video. We will see you in the next one.